Okay, good morning. Thanks for being on the fundamentals call this morning. As you know, we're continuing to build on the specific fundamentals that are making us better in today's market, which now is the most competitive market we've ever seen. So one of the things that I have been preaching over and over again is this is a skill-based market. It is critical for us to constantly be increasing our skill set. And a lot of times when we think about increasing our skill set, we start trying to get really creative in that skill set when realistically we just need to be focusing on getting better at the fundamentals. And so today we are going to be talking about how to do a CMA, a comparative market analysis, which is a critical skill that every agent needs to know how to do and know how to do well. Particularly in a market that's shifting and changing quite a bit, is really understanding and knowing how to pull the right data, and not only pull the right data, but what story the data is telling. And so I've asked Russie to be on the call this morning with us, and she's going to help us educate us on this. I actually was sitting in a meeting with her as she walked through this with one of our agents, and I really liked the way that she articulated it, and it was obvious that she has not only knows how to do this well, but knows the art side of the CMA. So thanks for being on today, Russie.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So one of the things that Russie and I were talking about, we actually got on the call a few minutes early this morning, kind of we're chatting about it, is this really remains true in almost anything in life, any sport or any skill or habit that you're trying to create, is there's a technical side to learning something, and then there's the art of doing something. And so this remains true with learning how to do CMAs really well, because there is a technique to it of click this button, pull this, enter this data, and then letting the software do the work and pull the data. But there's the art of it is really being able to really look at that data, understand which data is most applicable to the situation, which data tells the story that needs to be told. And then the second step of that art is in the moment you're presenting that data to your client and sitting down with them and helping lead them through the story. And as you know, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that is the art piece of the CMA, is really being able to pull the correct data that tells the story that needs to be told, and then being able to sit down and take your client through that story to help lead them to the result that needs to be portrayed at the end. And right now, more than ever, is my opinion that when we sit down with our clients for the first time, where before they'd sit down with their client and be excited, or sit down with their agent, be excited about their agent coming with the information for them to learn, I find now that we're sitting down in more situations with our clients where they've already got a preconceived notion of what they think the story should be, and they're almost they've got a pretty firm stance that they understand what the market is, what the market should be, what their home should sell for. And so it's not necessarily a matter of us sitting down and educating our clients anymore. It's a matter of us sitting down, helping them question their own story or their own preconceived notion that they've created, and then taking them a step back and then re-educating them on the reality of the market and helping them see the story through new eyes. Would you agree with that, Russie, that it's a little bit different now than it used to be from a CMA standpoint?
100%, because you really do go in and they always are like, well, the neighbor across the street sold for this, or Zillow, my Zestimate says this. So you're walking in, definitely, I feel like for me, how it's changed over the last 10 years is you're going in, and instead of you being the only source that they're getting their data from, they're really already doing some research in advance. So they've got a preconceived notion of what they think it should be.
Yeah, awesome. And it's interesting what you said, that, they always have the thing of, oh, my neighbor's house sold for this or that. And I find that a lot of times what their neighbors are saying they sold their house for something isn't even accurate. It's funny when you show them on the MLS, it's like, no, this is actually what it sold for. They're like, well, that's not what they told me, or that's not what I heard. And it's just interesting to hear how those conversations are happening at a much more frequent basis locally. Okay, well, let's jump into this. So, Russie, I'm going to let you drive a little bit, kind of walk us through, I guess the first thing we should talk about is in what instance are we pulling a CMA, which generally it's in preparation for either a listing appointment or some kind of consultation or helping someone understand what their property value is to contest their taxes or something like that. But once you get that request from your clients to say, hey, I'm really curious to know what my house is worth, how do you start that process and what does it look like?
So the process really at that point, if I don't know the home, I'm trying to gather as much data from them as possible. And I always use things like, I can verify this with your tax data or through county records, but really you don't know if they've finished the basement recently or whatever. So I try to get as much information from that initial appointment consultation first, so that even if it's just through the phone, I'm getting, what do you think your square footage is? Because a lot of times they're like, oh, I think it's about 3,000 square feet. And then you look it up and it's, 2,200 or whatever.
Right.
So it's always a good idea to find out what do they think their CMA is or their square footage is. I get like how many bedrooms, bathrooms. I always ask them, what are some of the features that you feel like really bring value to the home? Because I want to know going in, have they done some upgrades? A lot of my clients are repeat and referral clients. So I may have sold them the house a few years ago, but I don't know what they've done in the meantime. So I just always like to try to gather as much data as possible up front.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to be able to ask great questions, because I found too that a lot of times what a client perceives to add a lot of value to the home really doesn't add any value to the home.
Yeah.
So it's asking a lot of questions. I like the way you phrase that question of what things have you done to the house that you feel like add value to the house or set your property apart. So it prepares you for when you actually do sit down in front of them to address that, to say, hey, yeah, I love that flamingo statue in the backyard too. However, most people might not find value in that.
Yeah. It adds mad appeal, but not a lot of value.
Right. Awesome. So I think that's critical, asking great questions. And a lot of times this conversation is happening over the phone because what you're trying to do is gather the information to really capitalize on your face-to-face conversation when you get in front of them.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, what's next?
So then the next thing I do is after I've gathered as much data as I can, I let them know, okay, I kind of work through and tell them what a CMA, why, how we come up with it. I say, now I'm going to pull some comps in your area that are most like your home, and I'm going to gather some data for you, and then let's schedule a time. I like to schedule it right then. When can I schedule a time to bring the CMA over? A lot of times you're going to get, thank you. A lot of times you're going to get them wanting to I just want an idea. Can you just email it to me, or can you just tell me over the phone? And I always like to have that appointment. So I schedule that appointment before I even do any work. I say, let's get that scheduled so that when is a good time for me to come over and go over the comps with you.
I think that's a critical point, is that people are constantly going to be asking for information like this over the phone or email because it's easier for them to then go shop it, or they feel less obligation to use your services. So I think that's a really critical point. Is number one is we need to really use this as a drive for the appointment to help them understand we need to sit there and walk them through it. And then number two, the other thing that I do in this situation that I think is really critical is people feel a sense of obligation if you've put some effort and time into them. So even after you've done this for a certain amount of time and you can crush out a CMA pretty quickly, and it really doesn't take, as you get good at it, it doesn't take a lot of time and effort. I don't want to let my clients know that it doesn't take me a lot of time and effort. So I'm saying things like, hey, you know what, this afternoon, actually, I've got a couple hours time blocked that I'm going to spend on this so that I can really get to know your property and come prepared to help you understand really what your property is worth in today's market. And so basically what I've done there is I've portrayed to them that I'm investing, my time's valuable, and I'm investing some of my time into this relationship. So by the time I'm sitting down with them, they're already feeling, for lack of a better word, they're feeling a sense of obligation to me because I've already invested my time into them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, so walk us through the next piece.
So then the next step is obviously, you're going to look for the data, right? So I pop onto the MLS, and then I kind of come up with a criteria of what I'm looking for.
Awesome. Do you want to share your screen and just walk us through the process?
Yep.
And I know while you're pulling that up, I know we've got some other experienced agents on the call this morning. If any of you guys chime into some techniques or things that you do through the CMA process, feel free to chime in as well.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so realistically, it kind of depends a little bit on the property, and this is kind of where the art thing comes in, and you'll learn this a little bit more as you go, but depending on the type of property, you may attack this a little differently. I'm just gonna go with a property that I know because it's currently under contract. And so I know there's gonna be a lot of things in the neighborhood that have sold because that whole we talk to our neighbors thing. So you can do it a couple of different ways. I always go into a full search. And then right now I'm looking at mainly what's under contract and sold. And then I'm going to look at the actives as well. I like to narrow it down. I start first with just the last 60 days because I feel like this market is shifting and changing pretty quickly. So maximum I ever will go is about 120 unless there's something very unique and I'm having a hard time with comps, but normally I like to keep that between 60 and 90. And honestly, if there's a ton, I'll sometimes even just do the last 30 days in there.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point with doing a CMA. I always try to start as micro as I can in such a smaller area so I can get as much clarity as I can, and then I'm taking steps back out as I need to pull in more data instead of opposite where a lot of agents will start macro and try to work their way down, which we start as small as we can, and if we can't get enough data there, that's where we start increasing our search parameters.
Exactly. So then I'll put in the county, the area, and in this one, the city. So the only time that I really just leave it more as an area, if it's like a rural property and I may not find exactly what I need within the exact city it's in, then I'll expand that out a little bit. But I normally obviously like to be right within the city. The other thing that I do right here, because it just narrows my search down a lot, is I will narrow down the type of home. So this one is a tri-level. So I'm going to compare it with just tri and multi. If I can't find enough within that exact same style with a tri-level, I'll bring in split entry. But I just really like to keep it the same. So you can see I've already narrowed that down to 44 of those. Obviously, I'm going to go in and do a single family search. Unless if you're condo, townhouse, you're going to narrow that down. You don't want to compare a townhouse with a single family. And then a couple of other things that I do before I go in and look at the map is the square footage. So this house is 2152. I typically will look at about 20% larger or smaller. And then again, if I'm getting too much data, you could even just do 10% because that's really going to hone it in to where it's the closest. So we're going to go from about, 1,800 square feet, and I'm going to go up to 2,500 square feet. It's 21, yeah. That takes me down to 28. The other thing that I like to narrow down at this point is the year built. So this house was built in, now I can't remember off the top of my head, we'll say 2000. So I'm going to go from 1995 to 2005. I like to just keep that in a 10-year radius if possible. So 5 years older, 5 years newer. I'm getting down to 21 homes at this point. And then right now what you can do is you can go in and do bed baths, but I'll usually leave that for a minute. At this point, the next thing that I would do is I'm going to exclude short sales because they're not going to matter. It didn't eliminate anything. And I'm going to now go into, I'm going to look over here on the map. So I've got my criteria in there. I'm going to jump to this address. So that's going to jump to the house of where I'm looking. So there's a few different ways you can use this map tool. You can actually just draw a square or an area right around it, or you can use this little easy radius tool. And I'm going to go a half a mile because I know there's things that have probably sold within a half a mile. So there's really no reason to stretch out beyond that.
A couple things to note while you're typing there too is notice that every time she enters a new criteria, she's seeing how it affects the number of things pulled up in the search pattern. So every criteria, she's saying, okay, what's my sample size? New criteria, what's my sample size? And so as she's going through the process here, she's seeing how these different pieces affect the sample size and adding a new criteria to really get down to, okay, we're taking this even on a micro level, this is what we have, then this, then this, then this, getting it down to what we really want to be looking at.
Yep. So this is about perfect right now. So I'm showing 6 listings, which is really what I want. I typically like to have between 5 and 7 good solid comparables. I don't feel like you really need any more than that. And I think any less than maybe 3 is kind of a stretch.
Yeah.
One
thing when I'm looking at the map like this, a lot of times, because particularly in Weber and Davis County right now, you can have an older neighborhood that's been there a long time right next to a newer neighborhood. So sometimes I'll switch from the map view to the satellite view, so that if I'm like, oh, I can't quite tell from this, or I haven't driven the area, I don't know if it's a new neighborhood or an old neighborhood. Sometimes I'll look at this and zoom in, and you can kind of tell if it's a newer neighborhood, an older neighborhood, button up against it, just so you know. Like if I saw if this one off to the right was like 420,000 and this one in the yellow was 295, I'd be asking the question like, hey, is there a significant difference in neighborhoods here that I don't want to pull that one in?
Yep, absolutely. And that is one thing too, when you've already narrowed down your age range and stuff, that will help a little bit with that. But yeah, if you're just doing strictly an area search, that's going to be for sure something you want to look at. So then I'm just going to click on view results. And what I do first on here is I just kind of scan through and go, okay, what's going on right here? I make sure that all my square footages are in line with where I wanted them to be. You can see right now, there's nothing that's active in their neighborhood. So the reason this is important is, to me, that's a point for my seller that I can say, hey, you know what, right now, if somebody's looking in your neighborhood in this price range, you're going to be the only active option. Right? So that's important to know, especially if your neighbor right next door is for sale and you guys are same on the house, and your seller wants to list $20,000 higher than the neighbor. You've got to be able to know that that's active and have that conversation.
Great point. So one of the things I'll do, if I pull up a search criteria like this where there's no other actives, number one, that's a great conversation to have of how you can really capitalize and drive a higher price in the conversation. But then after I finish this CMA, I'll actually go pull a separate report as if I was representing a buyer to see what else I would be showing them in the neighborhood in comparison to this property, even though there's nothing within our search criteria. Because if I was representing a buyer, I would be showing them things outside of this criteria as well. And I want to see what other things the buyers are going to be looking at a tour in this area. So if I don't have something coming up inside of our search criteria that is active, after I finish this process of articulating the data and coming up with the price of what it's worth, I'm going to pull a separate one to say, okay, if I was representing a buyer, what would that buyer tour look like?
Yep. And I'll often do that even right when I'm going through the CMA with them. There's times I'll just pull up the MLS right then and say, hey, I'm a buyer, because I'm the buyer for your house right now. I'm the buyer, and you want to list at 295, and I'm the buyer. So I'm going to look up to 300 and see everything else that they're going to be looking at. And I'll actually go through and see, how do you compare with these homes?
And I think that's a really healthy exercise to do with the seller as well, to say, basically tell them, hey, become emotionally unattached to your house for a minute and pretend you were the buyer looking in this area. Which house do you feel like is the most value between these homes? Because then that's going to give you a bullet in a few minutes in the conversation when you just showed them all the data that the house is worth 285, and they're like, yeah, I think we should list at 320. Then I can go back and say, hey, remember a minute ago when you were the buyer and you were looking at these properties and you told me this one was the most value because of X, Y, and Z at 275,000? Help me understand from a buyer's perspective, why would someone pay 320 in this neighborhood when there's a value of a similar value at 275, right?
Yep. And a lot of times that's also important, because just like that, well, my neighbor sold for, or my neighbor's under contract for, it's good for them to be able to actually see it and go, well, you know what, you're right, they do have a finished basement, I don't. So if someone needs that space, they may not care about my flamingo statue in the backyard. So from here, I just kind of go through and I just quickly, you don't need to spend a ton of time here, but the idea when I'm looking at these comps, so I'm now down to 5 homes that have sold in the last 60 days in their exact neighborhood. So right now I'm just kind of going through and I'm scrolling to see what are the differences. And I also am looking for keywords like this one, for example, amazing opportunity for sweat equity, needs some TLC. Reality is I would pull this one out of my CMA because my house is in excellent condition. It's not being sold as is. I always read the agent remarks. And then if I'm still not quite sure about it, I'll just scroll through and look at a few pictures and go, okay, how is this one going to compare to my listing? Is this even going to be in the same neighborhood? Because the reality is listed at 215, it's a different buyer that's looking for that than what was looking for my house. So from there, I just kind of go in and remove some of them that I don't feel are relevant. This one, again, is there's no image available. It makes you go, okay, what's going on? It was just a quick, listed, sold same day, or under contract same day. Also, this is a side note, but I always explain, when your neighbor tells you they sold their house, that typically means it was under contract. That doesn't mean it's actually sold yet. Well, my neighbor's house was gone that afternoon. Well, it was under contract, but there's still everything else that goes into it. So once I go through and kind of look at these and say, okay, these are pretty similar style. Looks like very similar finishes to what mine is. Definitely going to use that one. Square footage is right where I wanted it to be. I just kind of scroll through those really quickly. I don't spend a ton of time doing that. I just want to make sure we're really comparing apples to apples at this point.
Yeah, particularly when you did an age range of 1995 to 2005. I mean, there's a potential that you have a 20-year-old home in there. So I think it is important to quickly, if it's a new neighborhood, all of them are saying I won't spend much time looking through the pictures. But a 20-year-old home is significantly different, one that's been remodeled compared to one that has not. So I think that's a few minutes, scroll through the pictures, see what they look like so that you're walking into it knowing, so your client feels like, hey, she knows the home, she's been through them, she can see the difference in the value.
Yep, exactly. And then from here, so for a more beautiful CMA report, I would recommend at some point you're downloading it into Cloud CMA, but for right now, for our purposes, I'm just going to pull up a CMA report and I'm going to take a look here. So then this is going to, if you're newer and you haven't seen this before, that's just going to put them now in a row to where you can see, let me move this a little bit. Now you can just see this is where they were listed. This is what they sold at. How long was it on the market, bed, baths. And I kind of go through and explain this to them as I'm looking and say, this one had X amount of bedrooms, yours has 5. This is why this adjustment takes place. Then you're going to go and I'm going to cheat because I'm going to pull up my listing number really quick. So at this point is when you would pull up all their information. So you're going to add in an address. If you know the tax data, or if there's a previous MLS number, you can populate it that way. Or if you don't, you can just go ahead and add it in right here. You can either click on that or you can populate the data. Sorry, I should have had that ready.
And so if in this case you have this one under contract, but in the instance you did not, you could pull up an old MLS number of last time it sold and it will pull in the data.
Yep. And the reason I do that, I always look to see if it did sell, because if I haven't sold in the house before, I like to look and see. It gives you a little bit of an idea of the condition when they bought it, gives you an idea of what they paid for it, because people forget. And then also, again, if they're not sure on square footage or if there's things you're not sure about, you can compare that and say, hey, when you bought the house, it only listed it at this square footage. Tax data also confirms that. How are we getting the higher square footage? Because sometimes it's true and we're getting it from an appraisal or whatever. And I just explained we've got to be able to tell them where we got our square footage. We have to disclose that.
And I think one of the important things with that comment there is a couple things that I'm looking for is I want to walk into this meeting really knowing what the psyche of the client is. And a lot of times, if I look at the tax data or even a title report, I want to understand how much money do they owe on the property compared to what I think it's worth, because I want to get an idea of what they're going to net. So even if they bought the house in the year 2000 at $185,000, and I'm just throwing numbers out there, and now it's worth $285,000, it's not safe to assume that they have $100,000 equity in there, because there's a good chance they at some point refinanced it or got a second. So I want to walk into it with as much knowledge as I can to understand, like, okay, well, if they have $30,000 worth of equity in the house, and their motivation to move is that they're just looking at upgrading a little bit or getting a little bit bigger, one more bedroom, that might not be enough equity for them to drive them to make a decision. So it's important to be looking at, they're trying to start connecting the dots of what's their story going to be. What is their motivation? How do I fix this problem for them, and anticipate what questions they're going to be asking you so you can answer them?
Yep. And all of those questions, I will try to get at least a little bit of a general idea during that first conversation, as well as I'll say, you know what, I'm going to have title. And sometimes I'll do that after I've already started the CMA. I'll call them or shoot a quick text and just say, hey, I want to have title company pull some preliminary numbers for me. Do you have an idea of what you owe? Just so that way they've got that down. So then what this is going to do is it just pulls it all into this little system. It compares them all and says, okay, if these all sold like this one, where should this realistically be listed? So normally this one is a little off, because typically I'm going to have some under contracts and some solds in here too. And I should have pulled that last night to look at that. Typically you're going to have some under contracts and some solds. So you're going to be able to say, okay, actively in the market, it's at 300 right now. That's what's actively listed. The under contracts are at 297, and what's actually sold is at 280. And then it's going to give you, that's where I come up with my price range.
Awesome.
And then I'm kind of prepared at this point for them to come in and go, yeah, but I have this. Yeah, but I have this. And so that's when I say, okay, yep, this just gives us a general idea. Now we can go in and start to make those adjustments.
Yeah, I like it. One of the strategies that we use in a listing presentation as well is we'll kind of take them on a tour and slide the properties in front of them of saying, okay, well, this one just down the street from you sold. They're like, oh yeah, that's the Johnson's house. Okay, that's not sold, da da da. This house is this. What do you think of that house? What do you think of the value of that house? And kind of I'm taking them through them making decisions of what the value is of their other people's houses in their neighborhood, and then circling back to theirs. So, okay, based on what we just looked at, and you told me that you thought the Johnson's house sold at a fair price, and that was a great deal, blah, blah, blah. Tell me, based on that conversation, what do you feel like the value of your home is in today's market? Yeah. And I'm going to let them say the number first before I say the number a lot of times, because that gives me the bullets then to say, help me understand from your perspective, when you told me that house sold for $280 was a fair value, and here you're looking for $300,000, help me understand where the additional $20,000 of value is coming from.
Yep.
And so I'm never telling them they're wrong. I'm helping them see that I'm right. That makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing that I think is helpful is to look over here on the concessions area. So once you're into that point, you can pull up to create a CMA report. This one is the summary analysis, which shows you, hey, this is the lowest price that sold. This was the highest price. This is the average, the price per square foot. And then also percentage of change is important, because where was it listed versus where did it actually end up selling? And then concessions, because I do feel like that there are certain price ranges that they're still seeing some concessions of closing costs. And I want to make sure that I'm preparing them for that. If I look over here and out of 6 houses, there's only 1 house that paid concessions, I'm just going to say, hey, you know what? We used to be in the market where you were paying the buyer's closing costs. That's really shifting. So based on what I'm seeing here in your area, we probably won't have to pay a ton in their closing costs. But in this one, I would definitely prepare them, because there was an average of $4,500 paid in concessions in this neighborhood. So that's something I would prepare them for, so that they're not surprised when they get an offer and they're asking for closing costs and they're going, no, I don't want to pay closing costs. Well, remember when we went and we talked about that summary analysis and the average was $4,500 that was being paid? That gives them it brings them back to the reality of what the market is.
Yeah. And when it's not a surprise to them, you can say, hey, remember when I showed you this data? We had this conversation. Then it's like, oh yeah, it's not like, oh, well, she tried to hide something from me because this is the first time hearing about it.
Yeah, exactly. So I always like to I like to be prepared and make them know, like I want to make sure they know, hey, if a home warranty is typical, I'm going to make sure that they realize you're probably going to get asked for a home warranty. If closing costs in this price range are typical, I'm going to let them know, hey, you're probably going to get a request for some closing costs in that price range.
Awesome. So which reports do you print up or provide in your listing presentation to show? Do you just do this side-by-side CMA? Do you do a full report on each of the properties? Show me what you print out or what you show your clients.
So a lot of it kind of depends on the client. So if I know they're going to want a ton of detail, I'll do the full report, and I'll also tell them, hey, I can email these to you, and then you can pull them up and look at every photo. So I'll do the full comp details, the comparison report, the summary report. I do map also, just because I do think it's important for them to look and see, like, hey, these really are right in your neighborhood. I just think right now, especially sellers in general are expecting that their house is worth so much more than the reality of what they're selling at. I mean, not always, but sometimes. So these are the ones that I'll typically include. And like I said, if you download these into Cloud CMA, which is free through Utah Real Estate, for Utah Real Estate users, it's a prettier design, and you can just download all the data into there. But then you just are going.
Is that just clicking the Cloud CMA from there, and it automatically pulls everything from your search in?
Yep.
Awesome. So what did you end up listing this house for?
So this house, actually, these solds have surprised me a little bit, but we listed at $295. We got an offer, and we're under contract to close in like 2 weeks, and our appraisal just came back.
Awesome. Did the appraisal come back good?
Yep.
Awesome. Good job. Beautiful.
So this just shows you what they're going to see when they look at this, if you're just doing even just this general report. The Cloud CMA, I will say you need a few minutes. You've got to load some data into there, and you've got to be able to, you're going to put in your picture and stuff, but it just makes it a little bit prettier presentation. But then they see, this is typically what I'll take with me.
Very cool. Okay, awesome. Good job. Any other comments from any of you other experienced agents on the line of what you feel like is critical in a CMA before we wrap this up?
Hey, Marcus, this is Rick.
Yeah, Rick.
Yeah, so the only thing that I was going to say is, you know, when you go and you're limited on what you're finding as far as like a multi-level, I've been finding a lot of agents are listing them as 2 stories.
Hmm.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy, but I'll go and do a quick look, and I mean, you can tell pretty quick just by looking at the picture.
I wonder if that's agent trying to do a strategy, or agents that just don't understand the difference between a 2-story and a tri-level, because it's actually been really interesting to me of particularly where we're getting so many new agents in the market that aren't taking the time to learn, because there are a lot of different styles of houses.
Right.
Interesting. Great point, though. And I think that goes back to the comment we made at the beginning, is if we weren't able to pull a big enough sample size from our search criteria, that's when we got to start thinking outside the box and be like, well, what other styles of homes are available? And that would be part of the process too, of me taking, flipping it over and saying, hey, if I was taking a buyer out right now, what would I be showing them? And I might open up the search to say, okay, what are the other styles of homes in the neighborhood? So great point. Okay, awesome. Any last parting words, Russie, on your side?
No, just, I do feel like it is just a little bit of an art to it, and you'll figure it out with time. And then just know, if you have a very unique property, it's not going to be a cookie cutter, and you're going to maybe have to search a little harder for some of those comps, go outside of your realms a little bit, but just make sure, because you do have to get an appraisal, make sure you've got some a good reasoning why you went. I had some horse property that sold recently, and I didn't have anything comparable wise right within that 1 mile radius. So I stretched it out to 2, just because you do have to be able to have something to compare it to. So just have the reasoning why.
Awesome. Great point. So here's my last parting words on this, doing the CMA, and we'll wrap it up. So for all you experienced agents that are watching this, I would, the question I would have you ask yourself is, have you got complacent in your CMAs where it's just like second nature to you and you're running through them? I would ask the question of, hey, is my skill level in my CMA, does it match this market? And what can I do to add a little bit extra flair or pizzazz to my CMA and take that, increase that skill set? And then for you new agents that this seems like a totally new skill set, something you're doing that you've never done before, I would encourage you to do at least one CMA a day. Just start picking a bunch of, like your family, your house, your neighbor's house, your aunt's house, whoever it is, just start pulling a CMA a day. And it's going to feel clunky. It's going to feel weird. And all of a sudden you'll find yourself just naturally being like, oh, this one shouldn't be in there. Oh, this one should. And then start putting those CMAs together, and then share the data. Don't just do it to do it, but actually call your aunt up and be like, hey, I'm actually running some, increasing my skill set of learning how to pull CMAs. As you know, I'm really committed to being the best in the market. And I actually pulled up a sample on your house. And now I'm not asking you to sell your house, but I thought you'd be interested to see what a full CMA looks like on your house today. And then send it over to them and have them look at it and then ask them to critique it. What do you think about that? What do you think about that price? And what you might be surprised is, number one, your skill set's going to be increasing. And number two, through that conversation, you might have someone be like, you really think you could get that in my house? Mm-hmm. If that's the case, we might be interested in selling. But it's a matter of doing it over and over and over again. So again, Rusty, thanks so much for bringing your expertise to the table. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys for being on. Happy Monday. Remember, July is a shorter month for us. Let's go out and crush the day and get ahead of it. Thank you so much for being on the call, and we'll talk to you soon.
See ya. Thanks.